Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about a few things related to soccer and hamstring injuries. If you're a Chelsea fan, this might be an interesting episode because I'm actually going to go over Reece James' injury history. So we're going to go through his injury history because, well, he's a good example of someone playing at a high level right now coming back from hamstring injury. So I'm also a bit of a Chelsea fan, so we're going to go through his case just because I was interested to look up his stuff, and he really is a good example because he's been through a few injuries. So we're going to go through his specific example, and then I wanted to go through hamstring injuries in general, give you guys a sense of what the implications are for Reece James, maybe as an individual, but then you can apply this knowledge to your own hamstring injuries, or if you're following any other recent Premier League injuries, you'll know that there's a few hamstring injuries out there. You could apply this knowledge to that as well. And if you stay till the end, or if you want to skip forward just to see the end of the video, I'm actually going to just talk about what I think is going on as far as why the hamstring injuries are increasing, and injuries in general are increasing in professional sports and in soccer specifically. If you want to hear a physio's perspective, then stay tuned for that. All right, so I actually pulled up some data. You'll see me kind of referring to my laptop here. I have Reece James' injury history going back to the 2019 and 2020 season. So let's go through it pretty quickly. He had a bruise and knock, nothing too crazy. That took him out for 2 weeks and 1 week, respectively. Then he sustained an ankle injury in the season of 2020 and 2021. This is kind of where things start going poorly for him, where he had to miss 4 games with an ankle injury. Then in the same season, 2020 and 2021, he sustained that hamstring strain that put him out for 25 days, so just over 3 weeks. He missed 5 games for that. And then unfortunately, so this was December 24th, 2020. Almost a year later, December 27th, 2021, he sustained another hamstring injury. So that's 2 hamstring injuries back-to-back years, almost exactly a year apart. This second one took him out for 49 days, 11 games. Once you start missing 11 games and you're a starter that a team relies on, it's probably pretty serious at that point. Moving forward, the same year, 2021, 2022, I just have here muscle injury. I'm not really sure if that's a hamstring. 18 days out. Then again, 2021, 2022, hamstring injury. This one was just keeping him out for 1 week. So that was clearly just a minor setback. He sustained a knee injury that was pretty bad at the following season. So 2022, 2023, that's starting to get familiar if you've been watching recent years. That took him out for the longest stretch of time, 60 days. Hamstring injuries, knee injuries, I'm not saying this particular case was related, but they often go together. They often go hand in hand. That one also took him out for 9 days. Within the same season, just a couple months later, another knee injury took him out for 35 days. And here we are again with, I think, is that the fourth report of a hamstring injury, March 1st, 2023. That was only 4 days out, though. Missed only 1 game. Then he was ill, had some thigh problems. Again, can't say if that's related, but then hamstring injury, 2022, 2023, April 25th. That one took him out for 36 days, 7 games, and here we are in the most recent one. He's recovered from this. He's already started some games. Right now, if you're keeping up, he was suspended. He had 2 yellows when he captained the team very recently, but anyway, he did miss 54 days for the most recent hamstring injury, which was August 13th. So anyway, hopefully that wasn't too repetitive, but you got the idea. This is at least 5 hamstring injury reports, and that number is really important because I'm going to go over some research in a moment. And so just remember that number, 5 hamstring injury reports in a matter of, is that 3 years, 3 seasons, maybe 4 seasons? So with hamstring injury, I looked at some research and I took some notes down, so you guys might find this interesting. But it's actually the most common muscle injury in sport in general, according to some papers that I read. And the other interesting thing is the prevalence is pretty similar to about 30 years ago. Even though research is progressing, it might be that the demands of the sport are also evolving, so things are getting more intense, faster, longer, etc. So it might be a question of the demands of the game, not quite the fact that we're not really progressing our research, but it could be a combination of both, right? Medicine's improving, but so is the demands of the sport. This is interesting. UEFA Champions League, okay, has seen a 4% increase per year in hamstring injuries. This is in hamstring injuries specifically over the last decade. So 4% a year in the last decade. So I wouldn't even say that the prevalence is similar to 30 years ago, because that one sort of debunks that. It might even be getting worse. All right, I'll give you my opinions as to why later in the video. I also found it interesting, professional soccer players, men have it much worse than women. I read somewhere where the risk is double, or women have half the risk or half the incidence compared to men's professional soccer. So how do they happen? Well, 57% of hamstring injuries actually happen during the sprint, and specifically they happen at the end of the swing phase or at the beginning of the stance phase. That's basically when you're kind of stretched out the most and you're about to bring that leg back in, essentially, or you're landing on that leg and bringing it in. This coincides with the fact that you're decelerating the most, hip flexion and knee extensions. You're trying to slow down that knee extension as you're kicking that leg straight out. The hamstring's trying to pull that back and control that. So that's the most common way it happens. It'll also happen, so the remainder of them can happen when you're decelerating, you're pivoting, you're changing directions. It's more of a closed chain situation where your foot's actually planted on the ground, but that's less likely. So what are some risk factors? I did a lot of reading before making this video, just wanted to see if there was anything that would surprise me, and there were some interesting things I found. Let's see what I have here. So one thing I saw was it was a little bit gray. There were some studies that sort of debunked it, but the hamstring to quadricep ratio is really important. If you think about it, biomechanically, they explained it in a couple papers where if your quadriceps are really, really strong and they're kicking that leg out, you're extending your knee, and the hamstrings are then responsible for controlling that at high speeds. If they can't keep up with that quadriceps strength, then you might run into some trouble. So there's some biomechanical reasoning for that, and they've actually been shown that has actually been shown in the numbers. When you actually look at risks, they find that hamstring quadricep ratio can predict some hamstring injuries. Not very effectively. In general, you can't really predict it that well, but you can. Asymmetry has also been shown to be an important factor in some papers in predicting risk, so how strong your left leg is compared to your right. Age was sometimes predicting as well. You have to kind of keep an eye out. If a study is suggesting that age is a factor, you have to just see, are they including the fact that maybe an older player might have hamstring injury? So they have to kind of divide those two variables up. And some of the papers I looked at did specify that was just age, so they accounted for hamstring injury, and age alone as a factor could be influencing risk. All right, let's see. Oh, the other thing is here, so retrospectively, so let's say you have an injured player already, you're looking at that injured player. After the fact, they've already been injured, we find that the muscle may not have the same eccentric strength. So I'm not sure if this is a question of, like, are we returning players back too soon, or is that the nature of the injury, or is the rehab program not good enough? Whatever the reason, they found in some studies that and I'm actually going to post this. When I post this video, I'll share some of these papers. There's one review that really does a good job of highlighting some of these things. But essentially, they found that if you have a leg that was injured, injured the hamstring before, that leg is also likely to have reduced eccentric strength afterwards. It's also likely to have reduced flexibility. That's another thing that has been shown in the literature to potentially affect injury history. They've even found in sprinters that the sprint mechanics change, and specifically in soccer players or footballers, the kicking leg mechanics change as well. So that might not necessarily explain the first injury, but all these factors could explain why someone is a little bit more likely to get injured subsequently. All right. This is the paper that I was really excited about sharing because this will also tie back into some of these players like Reece James that have had many hamstring injuries. What does that actually mean empirically? So this study I was really excited to share. It's published out of Norway in the American Journal of Sports Medicine in 2010 by Engebretsen and colleagues. They had 508 soccer players, and it was a prospective cohort study. So they followed all these players over the course of their season, and they got some really exciting data here. So in terms of the number of previous injuries, I always wondered, like, does your risk just get worse and worse? Are you more and more likely to get injured as that number increases? Is someone that's had one injury just as likely to get injured as someone that's had 3 previous injuries? So those questions were kind of in my mind, and they seem to have answered it pretty well. So out of their 508 players, they had 65 hamstring injuries. 4.6% of their injured players had no previous injuries. So that's actually a really small amount. Only 4 to 5% of all the injuries had no previous injury history. If that athlete had one previous injury, that made up 7% of that injured cohort. And it goes up as you go up through the numbers. So if a player had 2 previous injuries in this cohort, they made up 9% of the hamstring injuries. It keeps going up. 3 previous injuries made up 11% of these hamstring injuries. 4 previous injuries hit 15%. So what number is that? I have to do the math here. But 15% of the 65 injured athletes had 4 injuries prior. And here we are. Is this Reece James' number? I don't know if I did my addition correctly, but from the table that I read out, if you had about 5 previous injuries, check this out. So 5 injuries prior made up 20% of the total injuries in this study, and greater than 5 made up 21%, sorry. So yeah, there's clearly a correlation between the more hamstring injuries you've had in the past, increasing your risk for future hamstring injuries. Obviously, hopefully, if you're a Chelsea fan, Reece James' case, he's working with a team that's accounting for all the modifiable factors, but one thing that you can't modify is injury history, and it looks like data is showing that the more you've had, the worse your risk is. Another thing that came out of this paper that I really found interesting, it wasn't actually that common, not very easy to see, but I was wondering if position matters. So if you're a forward versus a midfielder, it's hard to find in the literature, but this paper commented on it. They actually found that the lowest percent of injuries in their sample size was center midfielders and goalkeepers. They're both around 4% of the injuries in that cohort. The highest was, you guessed it, wingbacks at 18%. Reece James also happens to fall into the most likely to get injured position. Just below that, so not as high as wingbacks, but also pretty high. I think it was like 14% center backs and forwards. All right. So I wanted to comment on a few things. There's also an interesting table of data that I saw that had Premier League team injuries. So if you're interested, just stay tuned for these next couple minutes. I'm going to go over 4 teams that really stand out in the Premier League, with 2 of them really high injured numbers and 2 of them actually extremely low injury numbers. I was really impressed as a physio. I wish I could just go into their medical team and just be the fly on the wall and see what's going on. What are they doing right, and what can the other teams learn for? It's a really drastic difference. So stay tuned for this in just a moment. And if you want to just skip ahead to my opinion on why injuries are increasing, fast forward to the rest of this video. Okay, so in the Premier League, you have a few teams that have really high injury rates. I'm going to start with two teams that have the highest injury rates in the Premier League, and I'm gonna see in the comments if this surprised any of you, or if it's exactly what you expected based off the media and the news, or if you're a fan, you're following your team. So the second highest injury rate in the Premier League so far is Chelsea. They have 12 reported. So not all of these are, orthopedic injuries necessarily. It could be players missing, games due to illness or personal time, but most of these are injuries. Not all of these are specified to, the teams. They sort of report these things at their own discretion, so you may not get all the information all the time. But from the table that I saw, Chelsea had 12. The highest number of injuries, 13 injuries, belongs to Newcastle. So I'm not sure if this surprised you. It actually didn't surprise me. Chelsea just got obliterated by Newcastle not too long ago, and I was shocked. If I should do some score predictions on this channel, but if I was to predict what was going to happen, I would have thought Chelsea being just stacked compared to Newcastle with all the injuries in Newcastle. I thought we would have won, but it goes to show that a team can still pull it together. And to be fair, Newcastle had some players returning just in time for that game. So anyway, Newcastle and Chelsea, the most injuries in the Premier League. The lowest injuries in the Premier League, as a physio, this really excites me, and I was actually a little bit surprised. So 3 injuries belongs to Fulham. So they're the second lowest injury count in the Premier League. And I'm not sure if you guys could guess this or not, but the lowest injuries, it belongs to West Ham. They only have 2 reported injuries or players that are out due to injury. Actually, I should correct myself, because when I actually looked at the specifics, I think one of those was a personal reason or personal leave or something. So I'm not even sure if West Ham actually has 2 injured players, but at most 2 players out. All right, so the last bit of the video is just my opinion as to on the topic of why injuries are increasing in professional soccer. All right, so I'm filming the rest of this video at the clinic. I just ran out of time at home. So this next little bit, this last section of the video, is related to my opinion on why hamstring injuries are increasing. Now, initially, you might be wondering, is this actually just over-reported, or is it some sort of hysteria, media hype? But the studies actually do show, the data shows that there's more reporting, more incidents of hamstring injury in professional sports. And in this case, I'm actually talking about professional soccer in the Premier League, but it's kind of across the board in a few different areas. Now, with soccer, I have a few opinions. I wonder what you guys think. Feel free to comment below. But one thing that I've noticed in the last season or so is this introduction of the VAR and the interruption of the game. So what that ultimately does is actually changes the overall structure of the game, and in terms of the individual athlete, it changes the energy systems a little bit, because, well, what happens when you take out the continuity of the game, right? So you don't need to constantly be running for like 90 minutes straight, but you turn into almost more like an NFL model. All these interruptions, short bouts of intense performance, but then frequent pauses. Well, the soccer players then end up shifting again to a little bit more of a faster athlete, but maybe less aerobic focus. I'm not saying that you don't need a huge aerobic capacity, and I think this change is subtle. It's slowly changing in this direction. It's not something drastic. But regardless, you can't ignore the fact that the game's becoming more explosive, quicker, and these, like VAR, for example, these breaks are not helping the situation. As athletes become quicker, faster, there's a few things that might be happening at the body in terms of biomechanical load and demand. And one thing is the hamstrings. They have to work faster and basically create higher output. So when you have a muscle, and let's say historically it was working at a certain intensity, and suddenly you're increasing that intensity, whether it's like the speed at which it contracts or stretches, or the amount of force applied. Maybe the athletes are getting bigger, so there's more force, more load that it has to carry. Regardless of the nuances, you can't deny that the game's becoming faster, and I'm wondering if that's why we're seeing more injuries, more hamstring injuries. I haven't quite looked at ACL injuries, but it'd be interesting too, because that's got to be correlated to the dynamic demands of the sport. So yeah, I mean, the interruptions in the game, the VAR situation, just the general trajectory, the way these athletes are changing towards more dynamic, faster athletes, I think that's all related. What else? I think the other thing I want to comment on is the schedule, and I don't think let's say a Premier League team is really playing more than 3 games a week, right? But I've noticed that you might have a league game and you might have a domestic cup and maybe a European cup all in one week. In some cases, I don't know, or at least like a cup game and a league game. And what that does is it allows for less time for recovery. In some cases, you might have a couple days apart. It creates more demand on the body. And if there's lack of depth on the roster, so you have such a intense pressure as a manager, as a coach, to create these results and get these points, but you only have so many players, you have a preferred, starting 11, let's say, you might be overplaying some athletes, and it's all about load management. If you are overplaying an athlete because of the schedule, because of the pressure on you as a coach, you're increasing their likelihood for injury. So these are all things as physios we should keep an eye on, and it's always useful, I think, to get an understanding of why things are happening. You don't want to just have an increased incidence of hamstrings coming to the clinic, or you're seeing more hamstring injuries with your team and you're just kind of like, okay, well, let's just start treating them. I think there's a lot of utility in thinking about like why it's happening in the first place. Anyway, that's my spiel. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. It means a lot. It goes a long way for this channel. And of course, in the comments, let me know if you like these types of videos, or if you like the workout videos, or a little bit of both. Whatever your preferences are, maybe the loudest sort of opinions, I'll try and accommodate. I'm pretty flexible. I think my personal goal is just to be consistent with social media for the foreseeable future. So anyway, thanks again for tuning in.